Wow, looks like this little upload program it doesn't give them any time to get ready. So you might have noticed a difference in here. Videos I did earlier today that I released earlier today were actually done over the course of the last week and a half, and I was just kind of going over editing because a few are kind of versions of the same thing, and the relevance to stuff going on right now is amazing. I don't know what our site's gonna say. God's in control. I don't know. Shortly after I wrote, I did the short video series about how a shooting spree isn't really the answer to a riot. Well, it's not the answer to a spontaneous riot. Then I made another video where I'm explaining there's a difference between riots and guerrilla warfare. I went into some detail talking about the 68 and 92 riots, the 68 Watch riots, which were mostly spontaneous anger type stuff, and then the 92 riots, which had a lot of guerrilla warfare happening in tandem to the riots. And a lot of times it was co-organization on that, and that's what some of the Army intelligence people, other people had deciphered from that. And there's a very large and capable state kind of task force type thing that they could put together in California on relatively short notice, because there's a lot of talent in that state. A lot of people would make themselves available, and they bounce between different agencies. So sometimes the contingency people, they're not necessarily they're not directly in law enforcement a lot, and so that's where law enforcement people might say, "Oh, that's outside talent." Reality is, it's all still within the state of California. What's coming out right now, and as I'm looking at another screen here to kind of go over some notes, is that the organization ACORN, now Barack Obama had previously worked with this organization. It was put into place as a kind of a left of center type thing in the 1970s, political action, community action, all that kind of stuff. It's actually a quasi-government alphabet agency. Years ago, when I was going to school, I went to Sonoma State University. Now, this was a university, left-of-center university, and my main reason for going there is it was within a somewhat reasonable commute drive distance of the place I lived at the time. Now, I regretted that choice. I regretted not just relocating to go to a different school for a number of reasons, but I went ahead and I committed to finishing my degree work there, so I did. In the tail end of that, one of the things I got into was the lecture series of going to lectures notable people. And I was feeling intellectually capable at some level of kind of engaging in little debates with people from time to time, including a 70s era activist who had become a math teacher there by the name of Mario Savio. Mario Savio is a very intelligent person, and kind of knew his side of the story better than I knew my side of the story on a lot of that stuff. And one of the things he told me, kind of one of those talking down to me type things, was, well, you don't really know the real issue because you won't study the real people in these things. And I was like, okay. And I'd made a remark about Winnie Mandela going to the school and giving some talks. Now, one of the reasons Winnie Mandela paid a lot of attention to Sonoma State University is that in the late 80s, early 90s, I want to say it was almost like late 80s, there was an anti-apartheid activist by the name of Amy Beale, I believe is her name, and she was an anti-apartheid activist who, blonde hair, blue-eyed, white girl, who would go on to South Africa to help register voters in some of the township areas, these designated zones for certain tribes. And she was riding in a car with her African National Congress handlers, I guess, on the way to see Winnie Mandela. And a spontaneous riot mob had formed when they went through some sort of a checkpoint or something to get into the area where Winnie Mandela lived. Now, Nelson Mandela was still in prison at that time. But I guess they were going to meet her and they were going to go do this voter registration thing. For whatever reason, the car was too nice. The people had security. Something happened, and the mob had spontaneously. Somebody thought she was a South African agent of some sort, and so word spread quickly. They dragged her out of the car and they beat her to death. Now, apparently, some of the ANC activists tried to shield her with their bodies, but they couldn't control the crowd. The crowd had already been primed to attack anybody white, and there was no turning that off. It was a spontaneous attack. It wasn't, and there was a lot of investigations, a lot of apologies made, tremendous number of apologies. Amy Beale's parents had gone to South Africa. I believe they still live there, registering voters, doing missionary work there, and constantly forgiving the people. So because of that, Winnie Mandela had developed a very intimate relationship with Sonoma State University, the university that had sent Amy Beale to South Africa to assist in the anti-apartheid activism. And I mistakenly thought that they were going to be discussing things on the race issue. What Mr. Savio said was, no, that's not the issue. You need to go, either shut up or go find out what's going on. So I said, okay, so I paid my $25 and I went to this rally with Winnie Mandela. I just paid my money and got in. Now, there was other members of the press there, there were other people, so I was not as out of place in the crowd as people you would expect me to be. But then I also learned that from Winnie Mandela, she was the one doing the talking, is that they had a lot of gender issues going on. And it explained a lot of the gender issues that were happening at that particular school, which were particularly bad at the time. It was so bad that a lot of the leftist men were looking at that like, gee whiz, this thing's bad, it's a write-off, why don't these people understand? And that was part of what Savio was trying to get across, was that the gender issue had long since eclipsed the race issue. And there was a dispute between, because at that point when Winnie Mandela was teaching at the school, Nelson Mandela, I think, had become president of South Africa, and then there was some reason they weren't getting along, they were getting divorced. And he found out, it was kind of strange, that Winnie Mandela was rumored, I believe she was charged but never convicted, of being particularly cruel to young boys. There was some issue with this, so that there was actually a gender issue going on I didn't know about at the time. But they were talking and were doing their chanting and stuff, and it was actually a women's empowerment type thing. Well, the other thing Winnie Mandela was there for was to try and recruit intellectually capable young blacks to go and run South Africa. And what she was talking about at the time was that during the transition period to a black majority voting population, there was a lack of enough educated blacks to fill middle management positions in government and what you would say commerce. Government and commerce. It meant they were taking over industries, and that they didn't have enough qualified, educated blacks to fill those positions, so they were recruiting in America. Recruitment didn't go very well for them, but the plan was to go on a tour through American universities, recruit young, capable, educated black Americans to go and run South Africa as middle management people. And a lot of what they were gaining were still white American activists, but they also had a large numbers of white South African sympathizers and mixed race South African sympathizers who wanted to fill those positions too. So a lot of the white activists that wanted to go over, it wasn't quite yet. So after talking about that, which was Winnie Mandela's mission to the United States, was to recruit at the university, recruit black talent to run middle management throughout South Africa, she really got into that gender issue, which was kind of like the meat of their whole discussion. And they were talking about equality in the third world, and gender issues in those countries, those sorts of things. Now, I had previously written and gotten some recognition for a paper I wrote about the Grameen Bank, No, that was done in a Islamic society, but it was mostly women that ran that in Bangladesh. It was mostly women bankers on that situation. So there was some other stuff. I was just being honest about what I observed and what I read and that sort of thing. So there was a question and answer session when they were talking about things that needed to get done and how they needed to be done and what kind of organizations would get involved. And there was a talk that they wanted private individuals to volunteer for this thing, not simply government missions, because there was talk of sending the U.S. government employees on a race-based thing to go work in South Africa. And that was going to be illegal. That wasn't going to be allowed. And they'd explained, and they were discussing that. So somebody in the audience said, well, why don't you just fund a private organization like this? Now, Winnie Mandela, in a real moment of honesty, says, oh, my dear child, I know what you mean. You mean NGOs? Well, my dear child, NGOs are the government. They are government organizations. That I remembered. That I remembered very well. And NGOs are the government. They are government organizations. I was right there at a meeting. I'm hearing these people. Nobody said, hey, shut up. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Nobody there. They're nodding. They're chuckling. They're smiling. As Winnie Mandela tells this young, idealistic, white college student that, NGOs are the government. Interesting. And so what these are in reality is coalitions of government agencies, quite often from foreign countries, especially when you're talking about UN type stuff, where sometimes one country funds it, another country puts their faces on it, that sort of a thing. Now, I bring this up when we talk about the professional combatant riot mob people who apparently have been hired through certain numbers of key ACORN offices in usually East Coast states. Now, this ACORN organization is one of many NGOs operating in the United States with quasi-government funding. In the 1990s, there was another such organization, I believe called the Bell Foundation, which had organized and run Million Mom March. Now, within these organizations, they received large amounts of muddily sourced private taxpayer dollar money. People would be given high dollar government contracts or jobs with the expectation that they make significant contributions to some of these organizations. The Bell Foundation in particular was headquartered out of San Francisco. They were given office space that we figured was worth about $10,000 a month at the San Francisco hospital. Now, when they were organizing another organization called Million Mom March, it was a gun control advocacy organization. They had some series of arguments saying that gun control was national health related, and we know that when national health and politics get put together for government policy, that those types of things were spearheaded by the Nazis in the 1930s. Nazi doctors who were trained in social hygiene, they called it. So this social hygiene organization out of San Francisco, the Bell Foundation was running Million Mom March. There was some people, when the NRA had disapproved them to go and do some investigation type stuff, there was some NRA activists who did it on their own. And they uncovered this organization was secretly being funded by the government. Now, one of the reasons they had some assistance in this was that there was some infighting among the Democrats because the wives, a lot of these million moms, there's really only about 20 or 30 of them that were head people. They were trying to get other people to go, but the whole thing is, in a way, a lot of the Democrat Party activism works is there's a core of well-paid professionals who are trying to organize a whole bunch of suckers and volunteers, what Karl Marx and Lenin would call or mostly Lenin would call the useful idiots. So what they were trying to do, but they weren't really all that good. Everybody knew, hey, there's money involved, we get paid for doing the march, and Million Mom March wasn't a million moms. But the idea was that they were the wives of a lot of Democrat Party politicians. They were the wives of the male politicians who were involved with Million Mom March. and they were paid very well. A lot of the money went in salaries, and that was kind of an internal controversy among the Democrats. Now, one of the things about Million Mile March is they also understood how kind of rules went. Now, I was at a Golden Gate NRA members meeting, and Million Mile March was sending professional protesters. We didn't know how professional they were. There was no indication that they were paid. But there was a bit of crossover from some of these queers who were part of the San Francisco power structure. And they had eyes and ears in a lot of government offices. They're very, very useful for espionage purposes. And the reason being was that the political power structure there would never totally evict the queers, no matter what. No matter how much they worked with us, they were pretty well in, and they ran a lot of stuff. But they were also kind of bending more libertarian than actual Democrat. Okay, and they kind of understood this don't ask, don't tell, leave people alone type thing. It was kind of their thing, and they run that political side of it. So secretly, a lot of them were kind of pro-gun, and so they were kind of feeding us a little bit of information on this stuff going on. And that was where but what was interesting was the NRA guy from Washington, D.C. is like, you can't do this, you can't do that. And he said, listen, we know these protesters who are showing up to gun shows are professionals. They're paid to do this thing. So what we need to do is we need to get, there weren't too many people with cell phones, but there were a lot of people with pagers. And he said, we need to get an alert list. There's going to be a pager, there's going to be a code. It goes out with a certain code, and a certain number means that we have to have counter protesters go to another location. Here's how it's going to work. And these queers knew how the game worked. And the Republicans were like, oh, well, no, we don't want to, we can't have a confrontation, we can't do this, we can't do blah, blah, blah. And of course, that same scenario was being played out in many other NRA activist type meetings, where eventually what happened was the GOA separated out from Neil Knox, who had previously been a very effective head guy at the NRA, was separating out from the NRA. I had become active with JPFO and some of these GOA guys. So, but a lot of times, state by state, it was really different. Here in Oregon, the NRA was pretty well eclipsed by OFF, which is a GOA affiliate, but really independent state or type of organization run by Kevin Starrett. But in California at the time, we pretty much did things through NRA, but the NRA was of California was independent because we were losing battles all the time, and when you're losing, you want to say, okay, the rules don't work for us either. So that's why things were starting to work the way they did, and we're just getting walked on. But that was when we learned about the concept of professional protesters. And the NRA people said, no, there's too much liability. We can't have counter protesters out. You can't have anything to do with it. At least not while wearing any kind of no NRA hats, none of that stuff. What was interesting was after that, the left began to infiltrate gun groups too, and some of these spin-off groups were actually just more surrender advocates for various laws coming down. But here's the thing, the Million Mile March people were not paid combatants. They would show up, they would make noise, they understood the rules. What we see happening with the modern rendition of ACORN and the paid combatants that showed up to Missouri that were apparently active in Baltimore, they're smashing, breaking, hurting people, doing stuff like that. Now, a lot of times, just like this incident I talked about in a previous video with these German, East German communist protest agitators who were active in West Germany. A friend of mine shot a bunch of them, and he was put on trial for it, but he beat the case based on German law saying, well, they were enemy combatant professionals, and the fact that they were limiting themselves to rocks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails, and this army guy whipped out a .45 and wasted a few of them, it didn't change the fact that they were enemy combatants. Now we're realizing, and what's coming out, what I'm realizing, is that these race riot instigators are professional combatants. They're paid to do what they're doing. Now, when we look on Yahoo on the definition of terrorism, I'm going to just look this up. Terrorism definition, free dictionary: the use of violence or the threat of violence, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political goals. So, in response to these incidents where a cop shoots somebody wrongfully, and I think a bunch of these incidents are police acting wrongful, somebody's paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for these riots to happen. Now, we have this recent thing happening where some cops went berserk, some bikers were having a major brawl, a bunch of stuff going on. One of the big fears of the professional, hardcore, 1%er biker clubs is that these guys put hits out on people. And one of their ethics that they're very proud of is they don't target non-combatants. Now, in the past they have. Okay, let's talk about the real world. There are rules, they've broken them. But generally, the rules that they champion are that they don't target non-combatants. Okay, somebody's not somebody they got a problem with. They try to avoid harming non-combatants. We'd like to say that the police really want to not harm non-combatants, but when we look at the Christopher Dorner incident, how much do they give a fuck? That's kind of a wanton callousness, though. It's not the specific targeting of non-combatants. So we have to applaud the police that usually they're not going to specifically target non-combatants. Now, when we talk about somebody who has a grievance against the police, they can usually find out who their grievance is against, who is the shooter, who is the order giver, who signed this bad warrant, who is the informant that signed the bad warrant. And in mafia cases, there's a reason why all of those people get put under some kind of government protection. The mob will go after them. The mob usually will not, at least not in no case that I know of. The mafia does not pay people to target non-combatants in a mass riot. I've never heard of it. Okay, maybe it's happened. Somebody can post below. I've never heard of the mob doing that. But what's happening with this ACORN thing is you got to realize every window that's broken, every business that's burned, everybody who decides that they're going to get out of hand and start beating and raping people, that is violence for political gain. Now, not only that, but the people leading and instigating that are paid to do so. They are professionals. Okay, $5,000 a month is professional level pay. Let's not bullshit ourselves on this. Let's not degrade these people just because they're on the other side. They are professionals. They are probably educated in what they're doing. Now, they may not be totally in control of the troops. There's reasons for that. Part of it is the troops may not be all that professional, but they are paid. Okay, they are the enlisted level of that type of a thing. Now, if I were to bring troops that I give orders to and am responsible for to a scene or a mission or anything like that, I get held responsible for their behavior as an officer, if I were an officer. As an NCO, I'm only in charge of maybe 4 or 5, 6 people, and then they're in charge of the 4 or 5, 6 they might be in charge of. Realistically, National Guard, the way the cutting scores, they were withholding my promotion, but the way my cutting scores and all that stuff would have worked, I probably would have been around the E6 level, maybe running a platoon. Functionally, I did everything for my platoon I could at about that level, even though I officially never made it over corporal, because my promotions were getting withheld for whatever excuses somebody could come up with. And it wasn't all PT. I mean, it was just, we lost your scores. We lost your scores. We lost your education scores. Oh, we didn't know we were supposed to count this stuff from California. It's the way those assholes roll. Which is interesting, because I was reading a BATF report that's been leaked out about the outlaw motorcycle gangs, and they're going over people that were members of outlaw motorcycle gangs, and they're holding rank, they're officers, senior NCOs, top secret security clearances. And what's interesting is the BATF tiptoes around all this thing like there was no BATF involvement in bikers. They only investigate them. and myself and a bunch of these fucknuts over at the BATF offices by the mall here, we all know that's not very true, is it? We all know that the BATF has its own pet motorcycle gangs. They do. They actually do. And a lot of the action that they do against other motorcycle gangs is just, they're trying to favor the guys. The same way they've had their own pet drug cartels, okay, down in Mexico in Fast and Furious. I've gotten wind that there was another ATF pet motorcycle gang that apparently wants to be rivals with whoever's running a bunch of stuff in Vancouver, BC. They've been running a Fast and Furious type operation to smuggle guns north. And of course it goes to their pet people, or whatever their thing is. And that's where we get into this really netherworld of what is an unlawful combatant. Because we've got paid professionals looting, rioting, and burning. These are paid professionals. Now they're paid and they're taught to go by certain rules of engagement. We're not really told what they are, but we're told that it's legal. Or at least they have attorneys hired to defend them. Now, I think in a roundabout way, we're being forced to pay for that. Well, at least those of us who pay higher taxes do. But then you've got the donors who are conned into that. But let's be frank about something. Most of that funding comes from unwilling or unknowing sources. Okay. Yeah, it's not fully disclosed to those people what they're funding, the people that do fund those things. But when these professionals are acting on a professional motivation to tear shit up and have riots, then the question is going to be, they're combatants, okay? If you're running around breaking shit and attacking people, you're a combatant. Now, if they've limited themselves to not use firebombs, if they're only beating people up, they're still combatants. Are they a lawful combatant? I would submit, and maybe this is just a mental exercise, they are not lawful combatants. This is a without rule of law situation. Now, the reason we would call this without rule of law is that under these circumstances, whatever is published in the law is so selectively enforced and so untrue compared to the actual policies which are being carried out by a actual chain of command, there's such a disconnect there that there really isn't any rule of law. There's nothing you can go read on a billboard that says here's what the law is, here's what the law is not, here's your protections, here's your rights, here's your responsibilities. Under these circumstances, it's very muddy. When somebody says that your rights do not include things in a Bill of Rights, you don't have the right to defend yourself, you don't have the right to defend your property, you may not have the right to continue possessing your property. They decided that your business, your place where you work, their place of employment is the one that they have decided gets burned out. And their decision to compensate you is, well, you may evacuate and go to a homeless shelter. And we got to understand that the government does this a lot. A lot of these people at these shelters, a lot of this stuff, this is where somebody is, if something was done to them, and that's how they take care of victims. Don't think that everything's $1 million payoff. Okay, you get beat up by a cop and are about wrongfully arrested, kicked to the street. They say, "Greg, go to the Salvation Army." Nobody comes out and says, "Okay, we're going to write you a check for $20,000. If you sue, you might get 50 grand, but here's 20 grand to walk away." No, they say, "Great, you're out of jail now. Go to the fucking Salvation Army if you want a jacket and a meal. We're done with you. You want something? Go fucking sue." That's how they think. That's how they act. But the thing is, we also have there's now evidence that there's a money trail that goes to somebody who is targeting violence to frighten or actually harm non-combatant civilians to achieve a political goal. That's right into terrorism. We've already gone beyond unlawful combatant. That's gone into terrorism. And under those circumstances, I think that the definition of who would get mad about that and go on a shooting spree, that's some rough stuff, isn't it? That really changes the game. Now, I'm not going to say what somebody should or should not do. Obviously, the consequences become dire. But it is worthy of thought and investigation when these things come up.